I'm really pleased right now to introduce Olena Zaitseva. She's from the Ukraine. She's a lawyer, a feminist, Nordic Model activist, gender equality expert in several organizations. She's member of the Public Council MFO, Equal Opportunities of Ukraine's Parliament, and she's a member of Yurfem, Women's Association of Lawyers, one of the founders of Resistanta, abolitionist feminist group in Ukraine. Olena is going to speak to us about Ukraine's gender policy, risks and achievements, who are protected, women's rights or other groups. So welcome, and over to you, Olena.
I will tell a little bit about Ukraine and about our gender policy today, and would like to share a presentation. So what about Ukraine and its gender policy? What are the main data I can share with you today? Very interesting thing about Ukraine is that gender in Ukraine is very closely associated with feminist groups, with feminist activities, and with women's movement, and with risk to traditional values. We have very strong traditional values in Ukraine. A lot of people adhere to the rule that they should follow the traditions, that they should be traditional, and they should believe in those traditions which are related to church. And this gives us our second thing, that is the main ideological opponents of gender ideology is the term itself, and the ideology of gender are church and extreme right movements. So what it gives us, that when we hear about gender in the news or in some political statements, the main opponents, the person or the people who will talk against this gender identity are actually not women's rights movements, not feminists, but representative of church or representative of extreme right movements. This is, I think it's really different to what we can see in Western countries, for example. And the third thing, that legislation of Ukraine does have some terminology related to gender, but it doesn't really have definitions of what gender is until recently, of some other terms related, for example, gender identity. We do not have the definition. What does it mean? And it mainly regards gender as a synonym of sex. So when legislation mentions gender, it actually it thinks about sex, about women and men. What is about the terminology? So we do have the terms like gender equality, gender policy. However, gender identity is mentioned only in several documents. And one of them is a labor code, where it mentioned only once, and it's related to discrimination, anti-discrimination policy, and in some documents, but not legislation, like some other types of laws related to health, for example, for public health system development, and some others. And what is the interesting thing, that those terms are mostly related to documents which are developed by our Ministry of Health. I think it's also related to the thing that this ministry has a lot of relations with HIV/AIDS organizations, and maybe it gives us some views at why this term is only in their documents, not in some other ministers, for example. And of course, we do have some risks related to the term being integrated into the legislation, because there are plans of government which directly mentions that they have to draft a law combating hate crimes, and the term gender identity is mentioned in those plans. And as a result of those plans of government, we do have several draft laws that already tried to include this term into our legislation of high level. And but yet none of those drafts were passed by the parliament. But I think they will be trying to do it again and again. So what do we have as regards what are our activist things? Where are the money and what is the politics? The first thing is interesting thing is that women rights organization and most activists, feminist activists, do not consider gender ideology as risk to women's rights or safety. Many people whom I know, young feminists or older people, older activists who have a lot of experience in feminist activities, they tell me that we should be careful in this regard, that the risk that they are in Western communities, we do not have those risks. We will not have the same consequences as in Canada or in Europe. We will have our different policies because we have a very strong traditional attitudes and traditions and ideologies. So people are sure, some people or many people, I would say, are sure that there are not so much risk of having this ideology as a risk to women rights or safety. And the second thing that we are sure that transgender movement in Ukraine receives lately very considerable funding and support in Ukraine. So this is like a fact confirmed by many organizations and activists. And the third fact is that state and local officials tend to give preference to other characteristics when we talk about defending vulnerable groups, and we talk about such characteristics as sex, age, disability, or place of residence. They tend to be more eager to talk about age or disability or place of living. They are not eager to admit that sex is also a vulnerability factor. When for example, when I had sessions with state officials, I see that they are more likely going to admit that yes, people who have disabilities, they are a vulnerable group. But when we are talking about women, for example, there are a lot of pressures that no, women as a group are not under any unstable conditions or vulnerable circumstances, that only some women, for example, women with children, with small children, or displaced women, these groups, yes, we should talk about them. But mostly what I see that when we are talking about protecting vulnerable groups, women as a group are not regarded as a group that needs protection. Of course, it's not always the same. We do have national plans and other documents that directly protect women and do have some certain provisions on women-related, gender-related violence, etc. But as I talk with state officials from different ministries, I see this trend that they do not want to see women as a group, as a vulnerable group in general.